phones, Babylons can't crack the code.
The Big 12. It is a conference that is really wide open for anyone to take it and win it this season, as there's more than a few teams that have a shot at actually winning the Big 12 title. In today's video, I'm going to be making my Big 12 predictions about every team, how I see their season going, best case and worst case scenario. As usual, before I move on, remember to smash that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Now let's get into it. The first team I'm going to be talking about is Kansas. Now, Kansas isn't necessarily a school with the best football history. In fact, they haven't made a bowl game since 2008, where they went 8-5. Ever since then, they've been kind of the joke of the Big 12. They are coming off a 2-10 season, where they showed some flashes in their last few games, even defeating Texas on the road. Now, when talking about returning production, Kansas is returning some of the most in the nation, as they're returning 82% of their production from last year's team to this year's squad. And honestly, I do like what Leipold is building in Kansas as of right now, as they did bring in a pretty solid and underrated transfer portal class, and it seems like the team is playing with more of an edge. When talking about best case and worst case scenario for Kansas football in 2022, now let me be clear on this is just my opinion. I have best case being 4-8 and worst case being 2-10. I do think the team is going to be all around a better team than last season. However, I don't think they're quite yet a bowl team, but I do believe under Leipold they will get there eventually. I just don't think it's going to be this season. On to the next team, it is Texas Tech. Texas Tech is coming off a 7-6 season. A season that was kind of odd as they fired Matt Wells after a 5-3 start, and Sonny Cumbie became the interim head coach, and they finished the year 2-3 under him, but they ended the year off on a big bowl game win versus Mississippi State in a 34-7 victory. When talking about returning production, Texas Tech is returning a solid amount with 61%. When I think about Texas Tech football in 2022, I feel like they could be a team that surprised some people in the Big 12. I do think McGuire is going to have the team in the right direction, and I really like the offensive coordinator hire with Kitley from Western Kentucky, a rising coordinator with a high and explosive offense paired with a defensive head coach. I feel like down the road that's going to bode well for some success and a team to look out for down the road. Now, when talking about this season, I feel like best case scenario, the best case scenario for Texas Tech is going to be 8-4, but the worst case is going to be 5-7. When realistically, I think they're going to fall somewhere in between those records. Sticking with the state of Texas, the next team I'm going to be taking a look at is TCU. Now, TCU, in my opinion, is coming off quite the disappointing campaign in 2021, as they missed a bowl game and went 5-7. Despite having a coaching turnover, losing Gary Patterson. When talking about returning production for TCU from 21 to 2022, despite the coaching change, TCU is returning some of the most production in college football, returning 80% of their production from last year's squad to this year's team. When I think of TCU football in 2022, I do think they have some real potential to be a really good team under Sonny Dykes in year one. My best case scenario for them is 8-4, and worst case, and honestly this may be a little dramatic, I have it as 4-8. When in all honesty, I do think TCU will be a bowl team in 2022. I do think their best years under Sonny Dykes will be after this season, however. With this next team, it is one of the most recognizable brands in football with a rich football tradition, Texas. Now, Texas is coming off quite the disappointing 2021 season where they just fell apart. They had a decent start, but they just fell apart mid to end season, finishing 5-7 and not even making a bowl game. When talking about returning production for Texas from last year to this season, they're returning 66% of their production from last year's squad to this year's team. However, it is worth noting that they are bringing in a top recruiting class and a top transfer portal class at that as well. I think Texas football in 2022 is very intriguing, as they're bringing in some very great pieces from the portal and recruiting that could make immediate impacts and really bring the best out of this team. and they're a team that is picking up a lot of hype, especially with the addition of Quinn Ewers, a top quarterback from the 2021 recruiting class and a perfectly rated recruit. Now, I'm not hesitant on Texas as much as I was last season. However, I do expect them to be a lot better than last season and make a bowl game no matter what, or at least you would think they would with all the talent that they're bringing in. I have best case scenario being 10-2, worst case being 7-5. I think they have potential to make the Big 12 title game, maybe even contend to win the Big 12 championship in general. But I do have some hesitancy with Texas football just because of how they've been, well, this past decade just being mediocre and kind of disappointing. Basically, what I'm saying is before I can fully buy into Texas football, I have to see them prove it first. Getting out of the state of Texas for a moment, the next team I'm going to be taking a look at is West Virginia. West Virginia is coming off a 6-7 season. It's a season that they weren't necessarily expected to be that great in, but they were expected to be better than 6-7, and it has had a lot of woes throughout the year with injuries and just play overall. When talking about returning production, they're returning some of the lowest amount in the Big 12 at 44%. However, they are bringing in a new big-named quarterback to lead their team in JT Daniels, which is a for sure upgrade over Jarrett Dahey. When I think about West Virginia football in 2022, I feel like they can be a sneaky team if JT Daniels is going to be fully healthy the entire season. Because if he's fully healthy, they're going to be a better team than they were last season. And I really do believe that for a matter of fact. I think best case is 9-3, and worst case is 6-6. However, if JT Daniels goes down with injury and he's banged up and they have to resort to their backup quarterback options, I do think West Virginia is in for a rude awakening. The next team in the Big 12 that I'm going to be taking a look at is Kansas State. Kansas State is coming off an 8-5 season in their 21 campaign, ending the year off in the Texas Bowl with a dominating win over LSU. When talking about returning production, Kansas State is returning an okay amount from 21 to 22, as they're returning a total amount of 57% of their production. When I look at Kansas State football in 2022, I will be real, they are a team I am very high on. I think they have a lot of potential, and I even have their best case scenario being 10-2 and contending for a Big 12 championship spot. Now, I do not know if they're going to go 10-2, I just think that's their best case scenario. I think worst case is 7-5. I am very high on Kansas State football, and I think they can be a really good team in 2022. Next up, it is Iowa State. Iowa State is coming off a 2021 campaign in which they went 7-6, in a year where everyone expected them to be in the Big 12 championship game and potentially be a college football playoff dark horse, and they just did not meet those expectations. When talking about returning production from last year to this season, they're returning the lowest amount in the Big 12 with 37%, and that's also in the bottom 5 of the FBS level for Division I college football. When I think about best case and worst case scenarios for Iowa State football in 2022, I don't think they're necessarily going to be as good of a team as they were supposed to be from 21 to 22. I think best case scenario is going to be 7-5, and worst case scenario, I may be harsh on them, is 3-9. I think they're going to be better than 3-9, and I think their best case is 7-5. I do believe Iowa State is a very well coached football team, and they just have a bunch of question marks when talking about their entire team, as they lost a lot of talent and production on both sides of the ball, whether it was to the draft or to the transfer portal. I think Matt Campbell is a great coach, but right now Iowa State is just a really big question mark to bank on them having a really good year as opposed to a really down year. When talking about the next team that I'm going to be talking about in today's video, it is Oklahoma, one of the biggest brands in college football, and a team that has had unmatched success in the Big 12 when compared to the other teams in this conference, especially as of recent. However, they are a team that has been talked about a lot this offseason since the leaving of Lincoln Riley to USC. Now, OU is coming off, honestly, a year where they were expected to be in the playoffs and potentially even win a playoff game. However, they didn't even make it to the playoffs, and they didn't even make it to their own conference championship. They finished 10-2 in regular season play, but they would finish the year at 11-2 after an Alamo Bowl victory. When talking about returning production from last year's team to this year's team, honestly, despite having a lot of players leave and enter the portal, Oklahoma still kept up a decent amount of their production at 66%, despite the media kind of blowing it all out of proportion. When I think about Oklahoma in 2022, I think they're one of the most intriguing teams heading into this year. As, yes, they lost quite a bit of talent. They also added talent in the transfer portal, but Brent Venables is also a first-year head coach. However, you do have to acknowledge the fact that Oklahoma is going to be a lot better on defense than they were this season prior. And they are bringing in a great offensive coordinator, one of the best in the game right now, in Jeff Lebby from Ole Miss. And I don't necessarily think the offense is really going to take that much of a step back. In fact, if the offensive line is better than last season, because I honestly didn't think offensive line play was that consistent for the Sooners in 21, I believe they're going to be a better playing team. When talking about best case and worst case scenarios, I think best case scenario for the Sooners is 11-1, and the extreme worst case is 8-4. I think the Sooners are going to fall somewhere in between those two records. The next team I'm going to be talking about is also from the state of Oklahoma. This time, it's Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State is coming off a great 21 campaign in which they went 12-2 and were the Big 12 runner-ups, and they even won their New Year's Six Bowl versus Notre Dame. When talking about returning production from last year's squad to this year's squad, Oklahoma State is returning 53% of their production. When I think about Oklahoma State football in 22, I think they're going to be a top team in the Big 12 and a really good team at that. I have best case scenario being 10-2 and the worst case scenario being 8-4. I think they're a really well coached football team, and even though they are losing a good amount of their production, especially with those super seniors that they're losing from their team from last year to this year, I still think they're going to be a good team. The last team I'm going to be talking about in today's video is the Big 12 champions from 2021, Baylor. Baylor was the Big 12 champions, and they finished their season 12-2. When talking about returning production for Baylor, they are returning some of the lowest amount in the Big 12. As Baylor, they're losing some key pieces on both sides of the ball, especially in that secondary for their defense. They're returning 47% of their production from last year's squad to this year's squad. However, it is worth noting that the most production they're returning on their team is in the trenches, on the offensive line and the defensive line. Arguably, their two best parts of their team last season, and it's all pretty much coming back for this year, and they even added more strength to it in the offseason. And if you can win in the trenches, you're going to be a good team. When I think about best case and worst case scenario for Baylor football in 2022, I have best case scenario being 11-1 and worst case being 8-4. I think Baylor is going to be remaining a top team in the Big 12, and I think they have a lot of potential to repeat and be the champions again, or at least be in the Big 12 championship game. Well guys, if you made it this far in the video, drop something down in the comment section below what conference I should do next, and what are your predictions for the Big 12 in 2022? Before you head out, remember to smash that like button, turn on those post notifications, and subscribe if you haven't already. B. Kelly out.